So what I want to talk to you today about is how to deal with robots in general. Robotic traffic, not just malicious traffic, but all kinds of robotic traffic. And I want to start with the general idea. And the idea being the data is always available to us if we want to figure out whether something is a human or a machine. We're just not asking the right kinds of questions. And in fact, we may not be asking any questions. But the important part is about this talk is actually, I'm not going to show much code. I'm going to talk about how you design a system that's able to ask the right questions and figure out the answer. Because no matter what code I put on the screen, it's not going to work for everybody here. This is a business and domain-specific problem. But the good news is, all the things I'm going to talk about will apply as, to whatever you're doing when you construct them in kind of the right fashion. So what I want to talk about is the questions, because those are the most important things here. And one other thing to note is that this is a game of asymmetric warfare. We cannot possibly catch everything. Our core business, unless this is your actual business, and if this is your business, raise your hand, because I want to talk to you later, right? If your core business is not catching robots, you have other things, you have better things to do, right? Their entire business is whatever they're doing against you, right? They're putting 100% of their effort against this. You're putting a marginal amount of, you're putting a rounding error's worth of effort into this. So accept that some things will pass. Accept a certain amount of loss here, right? It's not about getting 100%. It's about getting to 80, 90%. And more importantly, it's good to remember that the internet is powered by robots. This is what makes it all tick. Now, when I say robots, there's a class of robots that is very, very, very important to all of us. And these are these robots. If we do away with these robots, what happens? We disappear off the face of the planet. We cease to exist. If we make these robots go away, really, really terrible things happen. But what's interesting is that we actually employ full teams of people to manage these robots. Right? Search engine marketing, search engine optimization, whatever terms you have for this. We have huge companies, specific teams that deal with managing these robots. And they have it easy because they know how these robots behave. There's a set of rules, right? These robots will not harm humans. They live by a code. But all robots are not created equal. And it's really important to remember that. So really quickly, human or machine? Probably machine. Why? Because of curl, yeah. Human or machine? Okay. They're both machines. But it's not, I mean, so basically the idea is it's not always easy to tell, right? Things like curl, Java, LWP simple, wget, those kind of things, it's obviously mechanically driven. When that user agent is faked or spoofed, it becomes harder, and you have to ask different questions. And some robot traffic is more trouble than it's worth. So you want to figure it out. And actually, what I really want to ask is how much of your traffic is bot-related? How many of you know, roundabout, how much of your traffic is bot-related traffic? Okay, a couple people, always a couple hands. How many of you are at the levels where it should be? So you're pretty comfortable with what you've got? Yeah. So I think I'll have more hands here. How many of you do split testing, multivariate testing, tracking, any of that kind of stuff? Probably a lot of people will run this, figure out which features do better, which compete. How do we measure the success of our product going forward and the different things we're doing, right? A lot of us will do that. So one of the things that's very interesting about this is this robotic traffic can actually throw off your tests. Eventually, a multivariate test has to converge. You have to figure out like what features are important, which things win. With robot traffic, it's going to throw off your tests, and it's going to take longer to converge, longer to figure out what's going on. You're going to lose money that way. Or if they're good enough, or there's enough of a coincidence, they might actually have the wrong test win. And so it's really important when you're doing this kind of testing that you filter out this bot traffic. Otherwise, it could actually end up costing you money, and you end up doing the wrong things. And the question is, I guess, what are the bots actually doing on your site? For those of you who understand kind of how much traffic you have, are you comfortable with what they're actually doing?
They're trying to break in and driving by and not.
Yep. That's right, yes. And so let's talk about the common types. There are a bunch of different types of robots that we see. So I want to talk about kind of general classifications of robots and then dive into what are the interesting things about them that make them identifiable. So the first one I'm talking about is spiders, because they're the most common. Spiders are at the root of almost every other robot you see, right? When you see scrapers and scanners and other things, the way you find the content is to spider or crawl the page. So a spider's easy to find, right? They're very, very obvious about what they're doing. But they can be used on their own. Sometimes people are just gathering information. They might use it later, but they just want to see what's going on. We probably use them, or you probably use them on your own sites to find broken links or different kinds of things. If you don't, you should. They're actually really useful for helping you find and clean up things. And the other thing is, they're really trivial to build, right? Anybody can build a spider in 10 minutes. It's a list. You go to a page, you gather the links, you add them to a list. You visit lists until list is empty or until you've reached some sentinel value, and then you record what you visited. That's a spider. That's all it is. We can live code this right now if we wanted to. But because they're so simple and because they're so obvious, they're easy to detect, right? They're visiting every page. This is very, very not like everybody else you see. How many of you are doing some kind of e-commerce? Somebody's going to buy something. Like, you have a funnel, basically. At some point, someone's going to go to your site, be directed to a thing, and they're going to go through a purchase funnel, and they're going to be done, right? There's a very obvious workflow. They might browse around a little bit, but there's a convergence. There's a path that everybody will follow eventually. A spider will not take that path. They will take all paths, and it'll be very obvious. And so they deviate from typical behavior quickly. And this is actually going to be the meat of everything I want to talk about, is deviation from normal. So one of the easiest ways to test this is to simply split the verbs. So this is a pie chart. I think it adds up to 100%. I don't know. They're fake numbers. But the idea is that if you took a time slice of your traffic, last 5 minutes, last 10 minutes, and you did a distribution of HTTP verbs, you see something maybe like this, maybe not, I don't know, but you'd see a distribution of verbs. If you compared any single actor IP address against the time slice, what's the difference? Is there deviation? Is there significant deviation? Right? If there is, you have questions to ask. You have more questions to ask, right? Why did they deviate? What was their intent? And I'll get into that in a minute, too. So simply sampling the traffic and comparing for deviation is a really quick way to spot anomalies, right? That's to spot the spider 100 times out of 100 because they're going to just get everything. They probably won't post. Every now and again, a spider will post, but you'll see a huge deviation in traffic. It'll be almost entirely gets. And on top of that, with spiders, velocity is an indicator. Spiders usually don't behave well. They usually kind of get everything they can as fast as they possibly can do it. So you'll see, many requests a second. Maybe not the right word. Several requests a second, where humans aren't doing that. Humans are going to make one request every half a minute or 5 minutes. Very seldomly do you see a human do more than one request in a second, unless it's a redirect. But building on top of that, we have scrapers. So scrapers have one intent. Scrapers want your data. That's it. That's what they're there to do. They want to steal the data off your page. There are 3 scenarios in which scrapers exist, and you can deal with them, right? The first is you provide an API. So you have a website, you have an API. That's fantastic. Send them to the API or block them, right? Those are your choices. There's scenario 2, where you have proprietary data that you want people to pay for, or for some reason people shouldn't be stealing it, right? This is also very simple. You just stop them, right? If you see robots, you see scrapers, you let them go away. There's a third scenario, which is you don't provide an API, and you should. The answer to this is stop being lazy. Make an API. And seriously, this is actually really important. APIs are for machines. Web interfaces are for humans. If you want robot activity, if you want to provide data, simply make an API. There's a lot of benefits from doing this. You can make them authenticate. You can rate limit them. There's a lot of things you can do to control the activity of robots by simply forcing them down the path of an API. A web browser or standard web interface, you can't really limit, you can't rate limit a browser. You can, but it's not going to be very, very useful. There's not enough information to send back to the client saying you've made too many requests. But in a API scenario, you can give them rate limit, account, how many requests do you have left. You can do a lot more through the API to control mechanical behavior. So it's very useful to provide that API. And at the end of the day, if there's not a reason for a machine, simply don't allow it. Now, there's an asterisk here, because if you haven't figured out whether they're a machine or not, you probably want to let it through. You don't want legitimate traffic to be blocked. That's super, super important, is if you're not sure, let it pass. If you're selling something and you prevent somebody from buying something because you made a mistake, you've lost money, you've lost revenue. That's really important. So for those of you who are in e-commerce land, right, it's important to remember that those sales are very, very, very important. You will let some slide. And if you don't let any slide, that means you're being too aggressive and you're preventing money from flowing. So be very careful about when you decide to block, how you decide to block it. And we'll get into more later. But the good news about scrapers is they are dumb. Most scrapers are very, very ignorant of the world around them. Something as simple as this can fool a scraper. A link in a comment, right? This will never appear on the page. A normal human would never see this. They would never click on it. But if in fact a scraper visits this link, you know they're a scraper. And so in fact, I have a little mechanism that embeds this in a page. And if the scraper visits that page, they get blacklisted automatically because they hit that page. They should have never gone there in the first place. Little things like this are really simple. Fake pages. You post them, the scraper produces that as a link on their site. You find it, and you realize they've obviously scraped your page, right? Basically, little dummy tricks for scrapers, and when they reproduce that content that they should have never seen, you know, in fact, they were scraping your page. And so it's really simple validation. Now, some of the more advanced scrapers are context-aware and can realize it's a comment and won't include it. And so it's not a end-all be-all for things, but really easy way to prevent a bunch of scrapers. I've seen probably half the scrapers just disappear from a simple trick like this. So if you Google for how do I build a scraper, this usually would usually trip those how do I build a scraper in 5 minutes. It'll usually trip them up. But people are getting better. The idea is starting with simple. You'd be surprised how far you can get with simple. The easiest, most obvious, stupid tricks are usually what give you the most leverage. It's the last 30% that takes all the effort. And so when you're doing this kind of thing, start blindly, just mind-numbingly simple with things like this. Simple questions like velocity. Those kind of things are super, super valuable. And like I said, accept that a small portion of these intelligent scrapers are going to make it through. It's cool. It's OK. Once you get to 100%, you've gone too far. It's like test coverage. But detection of scrapers is similar to spiders, because spiders usually precede scrapers. But, I'll make that note here. But scrapers will tend to spend more time on each page. Most scrapers will grab a page, parse it, move on to the next page. Where a spider is simply looking for links, it's going to move faster usually. So scrapers will do the same kind of thing at a different cadence, but you're going to see a lot of pages. Or if they're a focus scraper, if you have just one or two pieces of information, they will only ever hit those pages and never anything else. And it's usually out of logical order. They will usually not go to a sign-in page, and then a account page, and then a view this page. They will go straight to the page they're looking for and just get it and never come back again. There's usually a pretty obvious order to what they're doing. And like I said, that's behavior deviation. It's all about deviation from normal. Which brings us to scanners, which we mentioned earlier, which these are the fun ones. These are the purely malicious actors. They're simply here to just try to mess with you, right? Their goal in life, their intent is to find vulnerabilities in your software. Break in, do bad things. All of you that have put a website up have this traffic. Every single one of you. Within about 10 minutes of putting an IP address up with a web page, you will hit a scanner will hit you. This is just, without a domain, just a simple IP address. Pull it up, watch your logs, you'll get hit by a scanner of some kind. It's just crawling the internet doing random things. It's drive-bys. Most of the time, they do it and they go away and they never come back again. Or you might see them like once a month. They might make their rounds through the internet and come back to you again. Most of them are harmless, unless you're putting up stuff with default configurations and really insecure, kind of always-on buttons. I think, PHP, Plex, that kind of like Apache, those kind of wide open to the universe things. If you put those up by default, yes, they're going to get you. They'll take care of you. But if you're reasonably good about your configuration and reasonably good about just general security testing, they're not going to bother you. They're going to kind of be noisy and go away. Sometimes they can get aggressive, but most of the time they go away. They're really easy to spot, though. That's the fun part. So they're going to do some spidering. They're going to do that kind of stuff. But if you look at the payloads, they're not going to be normal payloads. They're going to be all kinds of nonsense. There'll be fuzzing values. There'll be obvious attack values, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, right? When you see script tags in form input fields, you know that somebody's doing something weird. The payload, if you're just looking at the post data that's coming in and examining it, it's not that you're looking to block them on that first bad payload. It's that you're just taking a look at what's coming in. If you watch that, you'll see that this is different from all the other payloads that are being submitted. And there are other things and tools that I'll point you to that can take a look at that for you as well. But again, surprise, surprise, they deviate from normal behavior. And those payloads are obviously malicious every time. But there's one additional thing that scanners do that's you don't see the spiders and the scrapers do. They produce a ton of 404s. Why do they produce a ton of 404s, you ask? They're looking for defaults. They're looking for phpMyAdmin. And they're looking for wp-admin. They're looking for all those URLs, they're all those management URLs for things that might be left open or unattended. And if they find them, then that's an enumeration thing. We can get in and do some bad things that way. So if you don't have that, you'll see a bunch of 404s. So look for common extensions like ASPX, right? If you're not a Microsoft shop, you're not going to have those extensions available to you, right? And so that kind of thing is super obvious, right? They tip their hand very quickly there. And so in that case, you want to block these. Now, we have an asterisk again. There are times when your own company is doing these tests against you to make sure things are good. Don't block those. Let those go through. That's a planned thing. Talk to the folks in InfoSec or AppSec or wherever those tests are coming from and make sure that penetration tests, intentional penetration tests are allowed to actually do their thing. It's nice to block them. That's great. You've done a service and you've done your job, but you actually do want to see in that case if there's anything wrong. And those penetration tests are usually targeted towards your environment if it's a good company or a good team doing it. Web application firewalls can help here. How many of you are familiar with what a web application firewall is? Okay, good. Only one hand. The idea here is layer 7 HTTP traffic-based filtering. So as payloads come in, things like script tags or SQL injection or the plethora of other attack type scenarios, WAFs will see these, identify them as an attack, and stop them. Or at least alert or log that it happened. And so there are certain payloads that come out. For instance, how many of you heard about shell shock? Happened last year, right? Very simple payload, very easy to identify payload. In any of the headers, there was a little, little piece of shell script there that would appear, and you could, it would indicate there was other problems. So that payload was easy to identify. If you saw that payload, it meant they were trying to hack you. That was it, plain and simple. There was no other payload that looked like this that was not malicious. And so a WAF was really good at that. It can see that and make it go away. But there's one thing that's really important about WAFs, is never just turn them on. They block everything. They're big, giant, regular expressions that are like this big, and they're nasty and hairy, and they're always false positives. So unless you're doing something specific like shell shocks, or something that's very tightly controlled, you're going to get false positives. And you want to run a WAF in passive mode. Let it alert, capture those alerts, let those alerts drive other decisions you're making. Except for the things like shell shock. You can turn those on. But basically, when in doubt, always passive mode. Because you're going to get false positives, you're going to block traffic that you shouldn't block, and you're going to tip your hand that you're doing it. Because if somebody submits a request and they get a 403 back, and they submit another request, the same request with different data, and they don't get a 403, they're going to realize what your controls are, and they're going to test them until they get by them. And now you've basically tipped your hand. So what you don't want to do is either block or not block based on payload. You want either block or not block based on a decision that you know that they're bad, right? Because then you haven't given them enough signal to know why they got blocked. You're just saying, okay, I determined you're bad, I'm going to make you go away now. That could be in 1 request, it could be in 5 requests, it could be in 20 requests. But what you're doing is saying, I'm either blocking you or not. Don't waffle. So once you do that, you tip your hand. And then there's this kind of other category. Other categories are not obvious. I'm lumping them all together, right? People that are doing fraud. This is still abuse and attack, right? Denial of service, just normal or distributed. Espionage. Corporate espionage is a huge thing. I'm spying on you. I'm grabbing things. I'm stealing your data, whatever it is. Any other camp of abuse and fraud. We can kind of lump them all together. They're still malicious, right? The intent is still, I'm out to do something bad to you. But they're not quite as obvious as the other ones, right? They all have different behavior characteristics. You can't lump them into a scanner or a spider. And one thing that they usually have is a focused target, with the exception of denial of service. They usually have a focused target. They're after one specific thing. And the good part is it's almost obviously focused. They're almost obviously going after one particular thing or one particular set of things because their intent is different. And so detection here is a little bit harder, but it still follows that behavioral deviation thing. And so let's talk about that a little bit more, because this is when less obvious means it doesn't fit a equation anymore. I can't say, oh yeah, well they crossed the threshold or they did this obvious thing. We have to kind of change their assumptions. And that is when we get into anomaly detection. The idea here is that I'm looking for anything that lets us reject the null hypothesis. But this becomes the requirements. First, you have to define normal. How many of you can define normal? This is a common problem, right? How many of you just simply log to the same place? Log aggregation, centralization. If you do that, you're partway there, right? If you log to one place, you can at least have enough information in one spot to plop on top of it a query analyzer, a Logstash or a Sumo Logic or a Splunk or whatever it is that you use for that. Just doing that allows you to query and understand what normal is. So you're close. So I highly recommend, if you haven't done that, going down that road. It's useful for all kinds of things, not just this. And you have to define normal and also the things that would cause you to believe what's not normal, right? The several factors that allow you to reject the null hypothesis. What are these things, if they change, that would say this is wrong or this is weird, abnormal, anomaly, whatever you want to call it? So for example, I'll give you a few requests. And let's figure out what they're doing. We'll start here. There'll be 3 requests that follow this. The first is a post / login. And that's it. First request we ever saw from an IP. Second request, a post to the credit card's endpoint. The third request. And the fourth request. What do you see? What did we see here? They were both to a credit card endpoint. They weren't really incremental value.
There was some counter was implementing. You flipped through 283 went to 284 to 285.
The timestamp. That was timestamp, yeah. So there was a 1-second interval in between requests. What else did we see?
They got directly to their login screen.
Yeah, so a post without a get to a login form. So all these are details. I care about details, but I don't care about details. Because that's not what I see. That's what I want to visualize. What I want to see is a carding attack. Because that's the intent. How many of you are familiar with what a carding attack is? How many of you take credit cards on your site? You have a feature, I'm assuming, on your site that allows a user to enter a credit card, and you'll, to create a better user experience, you'll validate that credit card. You'll make sure that it's successful so that when they go to checkout time, they don't bounce because they have to retype all their credit card information in. It's very well understood that if you force a user to type a credit card in at checkout, they'll probably bail. And so once you have it there, the least amount of friction you can put in between a person and their money means you're going to get that money. And so we have this very wonderful feature where we validate the credit card. So if you happen to have a large list of stolen credit cards, you can test them against this endpoint. You can simply just enter them, and it will tell you if they're good or bad, because that's what we're doing. So all of you that are checking credit cards, there is a very good chance that you're going to look at your logs that you will see this kind of activity. Almost every single company that offers this feature is being carded. There's big, giant credit card fraud rings and command and control botnets that have a script that's probably for your site that will go and just do this. And they'll do it until you make them go away. And they take those credit cards and they either sell them on the black market or turn around and use them on your site. And it's usually a distribution of both, but it happens all the time. So this is kind of weird, but there's a few things that are going to identify this as a bot, and one thing in particular is going to identify it as a credit card scamming or credit card analysis bot. So of course we identified the first one. It was a post/login with no get. So we would have normally seen a get request first. So that's point number one. We found that 1 second delay. So every request had 1 second in between it. Now this is a pretty low-key bot. Only one request a second is actually, in this grand scheme of lots of traffic, you're not going to see it. It's actually flying pretty low. But the cadence is very regular. And so the other thing is this endpoint, right? Typing in a credit card number, or obviously it's a fake scenario, but typing in a credit card number, I cannot type in credit card information in 1 second. I know it pretty well. I've memorized. I can do it pretty quick, but I can't do it in 1 second. The next thing is the user agent. Firefox 8 on Windows 7. That doesn't make sense unless you went back and found Firefox 8 and somehow installed it. Because the version of Firefox that was out when Windows 7 came out was not 8. It was 3 or like 19 or whatever those weird version numbers that Firefox has are. It wasn't 8. And Firefox 8 and Firefox 7 are also associated with a certain web driver. Who knows what it is? Selenium. Selenium WebDriver will use that signature. And if you just Google this, you'll find out that it's basically associated with a bunch of bots. So you can Google the user agent, and usually people have reports on what it is and good or bad or whatever. But it's pretty easy to tell this one's a robotic user agent, or known associated robotic user agent. And the third is an assumption that I haven't told you about in our fake scenario, is that this is a US company doing US business. And the request came from Bulgaria. Bulgaria in itself is not bad. Traffic coming from a non-US company or a non-US place in a US company in a US-based business is usually some kind of flag, right? Somebody might just be traveling. Somebody might just, they might be at work in Bulgaria. They might be doing something different, and they might be on the road, and that's cool. But most of the time, that's enough to at least examine. It's an anomaly. You want to ask. And the last thing, what's the last thing? One more thing that we saw. So there's a status there. 302. Every time 302 is returned, and never is 302 followed. So any standards compliant browser would have followed that 302. So that alone is enough to tell us it's a bot. So we could ignore everything else and just look at that one piece of data and go, obviously a bot, because browsers will do this. Every browser on the planet that is a normal standard compliance browser will follow that 302. So we have enough signal to make a choice. There's one other thing about this that I haven't told you guys. It actually continues 10,000 more times, so it's really, really easy to figure it out. But the goal is, I want to know this in as few requests as possible. I don't want to wait 10,000 times in order to stop them. Because I've allowed 10,000 credit card authorization attempts before I stop them. That's a lot. Chances are in that 10,000, even if they get 2% success rate, they're actually going to have a little bank of stolen credit cards. And they're going to use at least 1 or 2 of them against you. And then you're going to have chargebacks, and you're going to have a loss because of it. So if you stop it in 1 or 2, the chance of them succeeding in validating is really small. And it's all about that behavior deviation. Velocity is huge. That 1 second tick, normally it's like many a second. Velocity is a really easy, really simple number to go. Any log query engine will tell you this. The Splunk or Logstash or Sumo Logic, any of those, ask them a question, out comes a bunch of data. Super easy to tell. Access patterns. What URLs are they following? This is where I say something that people will turn their head and question. Good user experience is some of the best security you can have. A strong, solid, predictable, and easy to follow user experience is a very, very good security feature because it forces everybody down the same path. Everybody has to do the same thing. It's great for business too because everybody does the same thing and it's easy to figure it out. But it's also incredibly easy to figure out when somebody's not following that path. So if you have a really weird UX that causes everybody to go all over the place, it's kind of hard to tell when somebody's going all over the place because everybody's going all over the place. Your anomalies are harder to find. But if you design your user interface well, then you actually drive everybody down a certain path, or a number of certain paths that are all obvious. That deviation is much, much easier to find when access patterns are obvious. So think about that, right? Time of day. Time of day is important. We all have peaks, right? In whatever country we're doing business in, we all have peaks. There are parts of the day where we're busier than others. And if you're seeing a bunch of traffic in a time of day that it's not during your peak, there's probably a reason to take a look at it. Doesn't mean it's bad, it means it's different. Geolocation, super huge. You can tell so much from geolocation. Now, geolocation is not a silver bullet, it's wrong, or it can be wrong. But you can prevent a whole class of problems by just figuring out what a normal pattern looks like. And even, you can detect things like account hijacks, right? Somebody always logs in from a certain place, and then all of a sudden they're trying to change their password from a place they've never logged in from before. That's an anomaly, right? That has nothing to do with robots effectively right now, but it is an interesting feature. So figure out where people are coming from and figure out whether it fits the profile. The river distribution, we saw that before. That's super easy, really cheap. You can throw that through anything. I think there's been like 15 talks about Kafka and Spark this conference. That whole cluster of stuff, so Kafka, Cassandra, Spark, you just feed that through and ask it to tell you when this, it's predictive modeling. Sample, ask, answer. That pipeline works really well there. I actually used it a couple times. User agent, not a good indicator because it can be spoofed, but there is something about user agent that's actually really important because you can ask it in more than one place, and I'll get to that in a minute, but user agent is an indicator of a fingerprint. So the order in which the headers are sent down is always the same. Every browser has a fingerprint. Every browser will send headers in a specific order every time. It will never change. So if somebody says, I'm Firefox, and they don't send headers in the order that Firefox sends them, they're not Firefox. Straight up, that is a fact. So you can use the user agent and check the header order and figure out whether they're lying. Now some people will just do this. There's plugins for this, right? Some people forget they do it. It doesn't mean they're malicious and you should make them go away. It does mean that they're lying about something and they should probably take a second look at what they're doing. But as far as bot detection is concerned, it's definitely a negative point or a weight against them. So it also turns out that it's harder. You end up having to write your own HTTP clients from scratch if you want to duplicate header orders. Because even things like curl, you can add headers, but you can't change the order in which they send them in. So you actually have to go through a little bit more effort to fool this trick. Really easy trick to employ, a little bit harder to defeat because you have to write your clients yourself. Success rate. This is actually really big. If they don't succeed, right, if they're not getting 200s, they're not human, right? 1 or 2 404s, you might have a problem on your site. This one has 1,878 requests and 0% success rate in a 24-hour period. They're not human because they would have been frustrated after 10 requests and gone somewhere else. That or their browser's broken, I don't know. But this is definitely not, not human activity. So huge deal, excessive response codes. 403s, 404s, 401s, 500s. You might get a 500 every now and again. If you have 500 500s, that's a problem, right? You're just not going to keep doing this over and over again. They're just going to go away, right? So look at the response codes and tally them up. Just like verb distribution, it's a really easy question to ask, but it actually gives you a lot of information about what's next. And now these are surface things, right? These are easy questions to ask. These are simple equations. There's nothing much to these. But we can go deeper. And what's important to remember here is that at the end of the day, machines will always act differently than humans. We can try as hard as we want to replicate the behavior of a human in a machine, but it will fail because it's easily tricked. Simple things you can do will trip up a machine, and it will act like a machine when it's tripped up. It will simply do the next thing it was told to do instead of the logical thing. And so we want to think about how machines think in order to defeat machines. And this is why we have robots that fight robots. It scales better than humans do, and we can actually force a machine to act like a machine when we get it out of its comfort zone. So we have a goal, right? The goal here is we want to block robots as fast as possible. In as few number of requests as we possibly can, we want to decide they're a robot and make them go away. That's the goal. That's straight up what we're trying to do here. So we have the passive detection pieces, right? The things where data's coming in, we can categorize and organize the data and basically make choices on the series of requests that have happened over time. That's the passive way. We don't have to just do passive. We can also do active questioning. This is about embedding detection scripts in our applications. So when your page loads, ask questions, right? You can simply embed some JavaScript, or forgive my French, Flash, and ask questions and have that data posted back to you, and then correlate that in time with all the other requests you're getting, right? It gathers information and it posts back. You have to have a system to support this, right? And I've talked about a lot already that we've had to basically build an aggregation system to collect and decide on. But this is one more piece of data. JavaScript can actually do quite a bit in the tell me about yourself world, right? I want to ask you a series of questions. There's one thing that's actually really important here, Navigator. The Navigator object is incredibly useful. It will tell you all kinds of things. There's links at the end, and we'll link the slides and all that if you want to look later. Forgive my JavaScript. But a couple examples. You can ask questions like, what's the user agent? So we've seen user agent pop up twice now. We can ask the browser for its user agent, and then we can look in the request and see what it submitted. If they're different, something's up. Screen resolution. If the screen resolution is 1 by 1, they're not a human. This is actually a really common thing you see on web drivers, headless stuff, right? Phantom.js, things like that. Actually, Phantom.js will come up as undefined. But headless web drivers are not going to have a 1024 by 768 or some larger resolution available to them. They're going to mostly just have 1 by 1 or some kind of small size to them, unless they're doing it on purpose to take snapshots and integration testing kind of things. But these drivers are not looking for that kind of thing. They're simply looking for a way through. Platform. Platform is an interesting thing as well. Fonts that are installed, plugins that are installed. Like I said, you can use Flash. Flash used to be a lot more capable than JavaScript. They're kind of in parity now. So Flash is a dying breed as well. A lot of people are blocking Flash. So Flash is less successful than it used to be. I would bet on JavaScript a lot more than I would bet on Flash at this point. But these details make it easy to spot a bot. There's one obvious thing. If this never executes, it's probably a bot. Again, there's the asterisk. People can have JavaScript disabled. If they do that, the web is broken. And chances are so is your site. And so if you affect them, it doesn't matter anyways because they couldn't have done anything on your site in the first place, right? You have to, in most sites, you just have to have JavaScript enabled. There used to be the era of graceful degradation and all that fun stuff, but that era is effectively dead at this point. I have yet to see any modern, popular website actually work the right way without JavaScript. They might work somewhat, but they're not going to be full featured. But there's more to examine, right? We talked about user agent, screen resolution, cursor movement. The movement patterns of the cursor are very interesting. The heat map that's produced by a human will vary wildly from the heat map that's produced by a machine. In fact, there won't be one. And if there is one, it will move so erratically, it would be impossible for a human to replicate those mouse movements. So angle, velocity, and position are very important for cursor movement tracking. You can actually build enough information to figure out whether a bot's driving the cursor or a human based on just that. What plugins are installed? If it says they're Chrome, the default Chrome has a set of plugins that are installed. The default Firefox has a set of plugins that are installed by default. They could have gone in and turned them all off or somehow disabled them. People usually don't do that. So if you look and see, here's the set of assumed plugins, I got none, something's a little weird here. Something has been tampered with. Fingerprints, super important as well. Canvas and WebGL both produce artifacts that are fingerprintable. The collection of all the data, user agents and screen resolutions and platforms and CPUs and languages and time zones, all that stuff combined can also produce a fingerprint. So you can actually store the fingerprints of known bots. So if somebody comes back and they have a fingerprint that matches other known bad bot fingerprints, you can simply make your choice right away. So it's a kind of a shortcut, short circuit. There is a library out there that's actually pretty good. They claim to be 94% accurate. Maybe a little bit less, I think. But actually, they have a version 2 that's coming out as well, and is actually becoming a lot better. But it's a nice open source place to start. There's a lot of good places, a lot of good things to think about there. So I want to wrap up and talk about a few things, and then kind of show you general design of something that might fit this equation. So, like I said, we employ teams of people to manage good robots. We actually should probably also be employing teams of people to manage the bad ones. And if you're not doing this yet, you should start thinking about this. In order to solve this problem, you actually need to build a system that does this detection. And it's going to be a distributed system. It's going to kind of span lots of different pieces of your environment. And it's going to demand a lot of resources. You're parsing every event that ever comes in through the outside and making sense of it all. It is not an easy problem to solve. I've released some things as open source, and we've built some things kind of on the back end as well as Groupon. But the general idea looks kind of like this. I'm omitting a ton of detail, but it looks kind of like this. And the colors are all washed out. Oh well. So there's a tool called RepSheet, and there's a link to it later, and I have other talks online about what RepSheet is and why it is, and you'll find lots of similarities in thought process. But it is an actor that embeds itself in Apache and Nginx and looks up in a cache what's known about an attacker, right? Do I block them or not block them, right? How many of you had to blacklist or block an IP address in a web server? What do you have to do when you're done with that? You have to reload the config or restart the server. Or there's a whole deployment process for doing this, right? You can do it through the firewall, unless you go through a series of proxies, Akamai's, Cloudflare's, all this kind of stuff. Now the source IP address that you're getting is not the IP address of the actor. You have to read the exported for, you have to parse it. At that point, firewalls aren't very good. They actually slow down quite a bit. The logic there goes off of the hardware and into some weird FPGA. It slows down, the rules are bad, it eventually fails. And it has to keep state. When state tables fill up into firewalls, and when that happens, they just crash. And so it's actually much better when you have layers to actually do this in a web server where it makes sense, where they parse the data. It's easier. So in a direct scenario, you're good. In a load-balanced or multi-tiered scenario, it's much harder because that exported for headers where the actual source comes from. Because if you just straight up block the source IP address, all traffic just disappears overnight or right in front of your eyes. Yeah, that's right. CIDR blocks are fun. And so it's a cache lookup. All the out-of-band processing happens, well, out-of-band, because this is in line on the request. This is a sub-millisecond request. It's a lookup, right? The thing that RepSheet uses is just a simple Redis cache. Slaves to loopback interface lookups. You know, we're talking about microseconds of lookup time. And then down to the application environment. We blacklist, we whitelist, and we mark. When you mark an actor, it says, I don't think you're great. Something's up, but I haven't made a choice yet. What that allows the application to do is change the way it behaves. So now our application can employ controls. Things like CAPTCHAs are an interesting idea, right? How many of you love CAPTCHAs, right? Good God. We punish our users because we don't know what's going on, right? That's CAPTCHAs in a nutshell. I'm going to punish you all because I can't figure out who you are. What a terrible security mechanism. Turn it on when you have a reason to turn it on. Just don't show it. Don't bother, because they can be defeated anyways. And actually, something interesting, if you've seen the new reCAPTCHA, reCAPTCHA 2, there's no more typing. It just kind of figures it out. They employ a lot of the tricks that I talked about here. These do work. They're employed by other people as well. But that application environment is good. Dynamic security comes from understanding markers, headers, things that say something is not quite right, change what you're doing. What that allows you to do is break the behavior of a bot. A bot's programmed. It's all going to have one path. When you change the way you respond, a bot will fail. So what you're doing is actually causing bots to just hiccup. Most bots are dumb. They have one path. If you break that path, they don't work anymore. And yes, of course, they'll go and fix it. But you're going to have that cat and mouse game. This is going to help you win that asymmetric warfare thing a little bit better. And then you have to visualize. So this is a picture of what we built a group on. I took this, I don't know, before the talk sometime. It's a little fuzzy, but basically, these are the attacks that are going on right now that we're seeing. The things we're blocking and the number of times we blocked them. So you see things like AWS East, AWS West, DigitalOcean. I usually, like all those big ones are usually VPS or cloud services, right? Somebody rents some time, has a box, off it goes, right? There's not much you can do about that stuff. It's going to happen. A lot of your bot traffic is going to come from those big areas. It's nothing against Amazon or DigitalOcean or any of that. That's just it's a paid computing service. So that's where the bots are going to come from. A lot of times, those accounts are paid for with stolen credit cards. So it's really, attribution is almost impossible. But in there, we've done a bunch of stuff. Right? This is a big view, but we can zoom in on stolen credit cards, hijacked accounts, fraudulent activity, all kinds of fun stuff, right? So you want to be able to visualize what's going on, to make sure you're not doing too much, but also to give you an idea of what kinds of things you're blocking. Security is not about this. Thumb in the wind, apply security, right? That doesn't help anybody, right? I can buy $5 million of firewalls. They don't actually protect me. They protect me from drive-bys. Defense is intentional. The things that we build should have intent. Security features, the actual defenses we build should be just as intentional as the product features we build. People that are attacking you are doing it with a purpose. Well, people that are succeeding in attacking you are doing it with a purpose. There's drive-bys all day long, and you're going to find those. But the people that succeed in defrauding you and abusing you and taking you down, they're doing it with some kind of purpose. Don't spend all that money on blanket security. Spend the money and energy building defenses against the things that are actually real, legitimate in your business. You're going to spend way less money and be way more successful. But you can't do it until you have an understanding of what's actually going on and why. And so this whole thing, this behavioral anomaly detection, classification, bucketing, finding bots, and also figuring out the intent of the bot, helps you understand what to actually defend against. When you do that, you reduce the noise. Everything gets easier. Your metrics get better. Your multivariate split testing, it converges faster. You understand what the signal actually looks like versus the noise. You reduce the impact of attacks, right? The fraud goes down. The abuse goes down. The drive-by scanners and scrapers, they get stopped before they even get started, right? That traffic just goes away. You improve the confidence in your data. The stuff that you have looks more like signal than before. When you clean that up, the business intelligence is so much better. You can make so much more sense of what's actually going on. And it's way easier for a business to choose what's next. So I have a few more minutes for questions. Like I said, like I promised, a few more links. If you want to know more about RepSheet, there's an organization for it. It consists of a bunch of stuff. There's Nginx and Apache plugins. There's librepsheet, which is a common core that they both share. That stuff's all written in C. There's a Java drop-in as well that's published on Maven Central that does what librepsheet does. So basically, same thing, asking questions, embedding that decision logic and lookup structure. There's some examples, that kind of stuff there. And I have a bunch of talks online that you can watch about what RepSheet is and how it's put together and all that kind of stuff too. The Mozilla Navigator object and what goes there. I sincerely suggest you look through that if you're going to do any kind of JavaScript client-side detection. There's more to it than that, but that is that's the treasure trove right there. That's where the most value is going to come from. And then the Fingerprint.js and Fingerprint.js 2 are good places to start for browser fingerprinting. And you will notice that Navigator is used very extensively in those. So there are better fingerprint libraries. There are commercial entities you can pay for, people that have databases and all kinds of extra stuff that they do, proprietary things. But as far as open source is concerned, this is all open source stuff. Repsheet is entirely open source. Fingerprint.js, the Navigator stuff, of course, is. And this is the kind of place to start. If you're looking for a web application firewall, mod security is an open source solution for that. Again, there are more commercial things that might be a little bit better, but I don't want to endorse anybody or recommend anybody. The open source stuff is a great place to start. Once you get your feet wet and you want to really dive in, you can look at some of the commercial stuff as well. So questions? In the back. Wait for the microphone to get back there.
Do you typically block agents based on IP address, or when you consider someone a user, you block them by IP address, and are you worried about blocking other traffic? Because obviously from things like the mobile front, we see everyone from the same IP address.
Yep. So there's two questions embedded in there. I'm not sure if you realize you actually asked two questions. And I'll specify because it's really important. So the question is, do you block people by anything other than IP address? And what about mobile networks? So mobile carriers are especially hard. This is a very hard problem to solve because on mobile networks, phones will round robin on their IPs. If you make a request to me and then 5 minutes later make another request down the hallway, you might come from a different IP. You might come from the same, but you might come from a different one. So if you block an IP on a mobile network, you will always fail because you will block the wrong person. So we actually whitelist mobile carriers. There are other mechanisms that we'll employ to block people, but IP address is not useful in a mobile network. There are other scenarios as well. Natted IPs. So big corporate entities have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees. So what might look like a login attack at 9 a.m. is just a few hundred employees from a place forgetting their password. It actually has no malicious intent at all, but it looks like an attack. And so there are scenarios that you have to employ different mechanisms for blocking by. So we actually, Repsheet can block by user as well. So if you get a cookie, you can block by any cookie. We have lots of different ones that we employ, so we do user-based blocking as well. So we can block a session or an entire user based on cookie data. And so that's also important, is block more than by IP, because if you block by just IP, you'll fail. Because it's not always sufficient. Other questions? Or does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Yeah. Other questions? Yes? Hang on, let's get the microphone.
You see any differences in behavior at a macro level between people abusing your web UIs versus web APIs?
Yes, the question is, what do web requests and API requests look different from an abuse standpoint? The answer is yes. There's still deviation in behavior. It is different though, because velocity is out of the question, right? You're going to see high volumes of requests from high traffic partners. So a lot of the signal that you would use to kind of sort out a bad actor on a web API or a web interface will go away. You expect mechanical behavior, actually. In fact, when you see a human on a web API or on an API, then you actually have suspicion something is weird. Or you see human-like activity. That's actually really hard to spot, but it's the reverse. So abuse in a in an API front looks more like breaking rate limits excessively. If you don't have rate limits, you should have them. Everybody should have a weight limit on an API because you can't control who's doing what, and they might flood you. Rate limits are good everywhere, always, especially at choke points where things can fail because of external dependencies. Always rate limit, but the access patterns are still access patterns, right? Chances are your API is pretty much has kind of a normal path. If somebody's doing a bunch of 404s, right? That's going to be weird activity. That's somebody doing some scanning, doing some weird things with your API. It might be that they have some bad code. Actually, it's probably they had some bad code. But either way, you want to let them know. 401s, 403s, 500s, all those things are indicators that something isn't quite right. 500 means you have a problem, right? And you should fix it. If you ever see a 500, fix it. Always, always fix it. Because to me, as an attacker, a 500 means a hole. It means you've done something wrong, and the chances of me getting in are much, much higher. If I do a scraper or a scanner or a spider, and I ever see a 500, I'm just going to stop what I'm doing and see what else I can do there. especially if that error message is nice and juicy, like a SQL driver error message or something like that, right? But I mean, that's really important, right? Those things are huge indicators to an attacker that something is wrong. And if you see a high number of 500s, that's usually somebody messing around. So all bets are off when it comes to machines. Things are different. You have to produce different models to answer that question. So there's not really any feature parity or any model parity between machines and web interfaces. You ask different questions and look for different signal. Other, yep.
I use a standard set of 3 tools that I've used on my Linux boxes for years and years, and it's not web-specific stuff, but I always have LogWatch to tell me who's going around jingling the doorknobs. I have fail-to-ban to chase off those that are persistently jingling, and I have Tripwire to tell me, did somebody get in the room?
Yeah, sure.
So comments on that?
Sure. So the question is, tools like Tripwire, fail-to-ban, LogWatch, those things are useful. They are useful. A couple of things about them that are interesting, right? These tools don't scale well without ops automation, right? So this problem is a little bit easier to solve when you have a dozen boxes. When you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of machines, this problem gets more interesting. LogWatch is no longer effective, right? You have to log everything in a central point and have an analyzer. And actually, what you really have to do, honestly, is there's a bunch of stuff in between, right? Kafka's great at this. Throw everything into Kafka, apply a little bit of back pressure, sort it out, right? Let Kafka and some other thing, right, consume this. The things I talked about earlier in the conference, right? The Kafka's, Cassandra, Spark, that combination, you can collect your way to freedom in that case, right? They're good tools. They can handle larger volumes of things, right? Tripwire is incredibly maintenance heavy, right? The amount of things you have to do to make Tripwire not produce so many alerts you want to rip your eyes out is like, it's big, right? You have to employ somebody full time to make that work. And when you've got 10, 20, 30,000 boxes out there, all doing different things, that just gets overwhelming, right? And so fail-to-ban is more of an SSH thing than an HTTP thing, right? And again, at the same time, fail-to-ban can be employed on HTTP, but we're talking about that single source and destination problem versus the many levels of indirection x-forwarded for problem. It just can't do it, right? So those are great tools on a small scale, but on even a medium scale, they just stop working. And so you need to have something bigger that can consume a bigger view and kind of deploy more generically than stuff that sits on every box, right? You don't really want anything on every box. What you want is stuff at the edges that's going to look, and stuff in the middle that's going to consume that signal and kind of push the information back out. So it's basically a race to maintain global state, which is really kind of crappy, but it's the easiest way to solve the problem. Keep going. Yeah.
So one follow-up on that, then. Given that I do have just a very small number of servers and I can manage these things, are those the right tools to be using? I picked those like 10 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
Is there a better thing than LogWatch? Is there a better thing to do what they currently do?
There's always better, but better's an opinion, right? The question is, like, at a small scale, are those tools okay? And the answer is yeah, they're fine. As you grow, you find the right tools that work. What I've talked about as a scenario, I'm assuming at least a moderate level of traffic, right? More than 50 boxes, right? Basically, more than a number of servers that's manageable by a person in their head. The kind of thing where you need to employ some kind of operational automation. Now, you should do that with 2 boxes, but realistically, right? Feasibly, what can a small army of sysadmins not only control on their own? That plus 1 is basically what I'm looking at. Is how do we solve the problem for a little bit bigger scale? So Groupon is certainly not the largest scale site on the internet, but it's not small by any means. We actually do have a pretty reasonable volume of traffic, so we have to solve the problem at that scale. Other questions? Okay, cool. Oh, thank you.